Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You'll learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Rachel Hansen is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for our speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before we end our time together today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Burd. Camden Burd is an assistant professor of history at Clemson University, where he teaches on subjects related to American history, environmental history, and the digital humanities. His work on Midwestern environmental history has been published in several journals and edited collections. His book, The Roots of Flower City, Horticulture, Empire, and the Remaking of Rochester, New York, was recently published by Cornell University Press. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Burd to begin the webinar.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. This is, I know there's a room out there with people in it, but I can't see any of you, so this is quite odd. But I am happy to be here. As was mentioned, I'm not really a historian of Iowa, but I am interested in the history of the Midwest, and particularly I'm interested in sort of environmental history and what that can tell us about the history of the United States, but also the history of the Midwest, and in our cases today, the history of Iowa. Now, I'm quite fond of Iowa. I'll talk a lot about Iowa today. I do consider us sort of neighbors. I did live in Illinois for 4 years, in rural Illinois, so I see us as close kin. We are neighbors, and so therefore, that's my credentials here to be able to talk to you about Iowa today. Just to give you sort of an overview here of what I will be talking about. It's a little bit of a conceptual history of what is environmental history, what it can tell us about the history of the state of Iowa. And so as I lay out and we get going in this today, I'm really going to sort of start with a definitional overview, something that might be in a college lecture of sort of what is environmental history? What do we mean by this field? What are some of the sort of ideological or sort of conceptual frameworks that we use to study the past and what makes it different maybe than other sorts of historical examination. And then I'm going to sort of do these little vignettes about sort of different times in Iowa history that can give us sort of exemplary models of what I'm trying to get at here today. I look forward to the Q&A at the end, and I'm excited to get started on this today. Before I jump into sort of what is environmental history, I actually think it's interesting to understand the history of environmental history. This might seem sort of like a bizarre concept, but the actual discipline, the study of the environment, the historical uses of the environment is sort of a relatively new feature of the profession of history. It really is born out of the environmental activism of the 1960s and 1970s, a period of intense environmental activism within the United States. This is the post-World War II years in which you have brand new industrial processes. You see the widespread use of chemicals, fairly unregulated dumping processes, right? Chemical processes, industrial processes. You also see the widespread growth of suburbs throughout America at this time period. And there's a lot of evidence of these changes that Americans are paying attention to at this time period, right? Smog is starting to define many of the major American cityscapes, which can lead to airborne illnesses and harm to human bodies. With vast construction and the sprawl that occurs from suburban sprawl, forests are falling, swamps are starting to get filled in, and you'll start to see the drastic decline in a lot of animal species in North America. You're also seeing sort of like very obvious examples of industrial pollution. Rivers are literally catching on fire. The most famous, of course, is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. These are sort of these obvious signs in which humans have, as these activists will see it, right? Sullied nature, right? This is decline, and that is prompting a wave of activism throughout the country that will lead historians to start asking the questions of like, well, how did we get here, right? There is clearly a historic relationship between humans and the natural world, and maybe that's something that we should be studying here. Um, I've have these two slides up, or these two pictures up. These are pulls from the Daily Iowan, the newspaper out of the University of Iowa here from 1970 in April. Now that is significant because that is the first Earth Day celebration in April of 1970, or celebration teach-in movement. I think today I sort of talk about this with students. I think the Earth Day is sort of like, oh yeah, it's on the calendar. We do something for Earth Day. I think it sort of diminishes how significant the first Earth Day teach-in was. This was largely a grassroots movement. Yes, it did have a sort of central figure in Gaylord Nelson who helped to arrange this, but you have thousands of teach-in activities planned throughout the United States in 1970, in April of 1970, the University of Iowa being one of them here. And you can see on the left-hand side here, right, this is an editorial on the front page of the Daily Iowan, sort of talking about the need to consider the environment, to see where things have gone. And on the right side, you have the actual program for the day for that teach-in. I still think it's interesting. I mean, like, yes, it's maybe not so much a surprise that a university would lead these teach-ins, but I think what's really fascinating is that in this first wave of Earth Day, you have a lot of elementary schools, middle schools, high schools throughout the country, many rural communities, small towns that are organizing these teach-ins. I still think it would be a fun project for anyone out there who's looking for some cool projects to sort of collect and try to create this vast network of where these teach-ins are happening. Truly, thousands of them are occurring in a short period of time. So it makes sense in the case of what we're looking at here today, right? That the university, the academics are thinking about the ecological effects of these changes of industrialization and chemical use and whatnot. And that is going to lead us to historians who might be a little slower to get around to the take of also being interested in these conversations and these historical questions of humans and environmental use. And in this moment, a new field of history is born. So what is environmental history? I'm going to lay out just sort of four key points that we will talk about here. It is the study of how humans have shaped the natural world over the course of history. Very much sort of how have humans actually shaped, changed, altered natural ecosystems over time. It is also a question of sort of cultural value as well. That is to say, it is the study of how humans have viewed, valued, and understood nature throughout history. So we're going to study both the physical changes, but also grappling with sort of how did humans understand nature, right? This is sort of history of science, history of cultural values as well. And perhaps where the field starts to get a little more interesting or breaks away from other disciplines is it is a study of how nature and non-human agents have influenced human history. We take seriously the notion that non-human agents are in fact actors in the historical story or in the historical narrative as well. And that means that nature and non-human agents are not simply a backdrop to human history, but are in fact vital components of it and therefore should be studied alongside human history. All right. So what does this mean? Let's look at a few examples of what I'm talking about here, right? If we are to take environmental actors seriously, right, we have to reframe some of the ways that we think about history and even the flow of time. Time is different when we consider these things. So this requires humans to consider that many non-human things, living and non-living, don't really move at the time scale that you and I might consider sort of quote unquote normal, right? Or sort of realistic, right? This means that we must consider time on very long scales or on very short scales. So what does that mean, right? It means that we must think about the speed of glaciers, of decomposition, about the time it takes for entire landscapes to be formed, right? These things move at incomprehensible lengths of time, right? Take, for instance, the filling of a gas tank. I'm sure many of you have put gas in your car today, right? Or during this week, right? Consider what fuel like gasoline really is. I love this image. This is the world's largest truck stop on I-80. Personally, has some significance to me when I lived in Michigan, but I did my undergraduate at the University of Utah. I-80 was my road, and I always, you can't miss the signs for the world's largest truck stop. So I felt like I'd put this in here as well, right? Still holds the title as the world's largest truck stop, though I'm currently at Clemson University in the southern place, and I feel like Bucky's is trying to give this place a run for its money, which is a big deal down here. Anyway, okay, let's think about this. You put fuel in your car at the world's largest truck stop in I-80. What's really going on there? Well, if we want to understand a gas station, right, we actually have to go back a really far period of time to the Carboniferous period, which is roughly 360 to 286 million years ago, right? This is a period in which the Earth is incredibly warm, when much of the Earth's surface is actually covered in sort of swamps and shallow seas. And the sun, through the process of photosynthesis, is providing plant material with an incredible energy, which serves as fuel not only for those plants, but also for any animals that are consuming those plants, right? And this is very much still what happens today, right? Photosynthesis creates energy, plants turn it into sugars, which then animals eat, humans eat, et cetera, et cetera. Now, during the Carboniferous period, these animals, these plants, these organic materials, they're going to die. They're going to slowly fall to the bottom of these pools where they collect, they break down, but as I sit there, sort of this pressure of this organic material starts sort of building on itself, and it's creating this dead organic material. It's transforming it into high energy um, material, right, with a small mass. This takes a long time to occur, right? Millions of years of decaying material to die, to continue to push down on itself over and over and over. It becomes what we know today as a fossil fuel, right? Now, this fuel is not just combustible fuel for all sorts of industrial processes, right? Like it makes consumer goods. We put gasoline in our cars. Other gases are used to heat homes. Fuel then is a major concern, as we know today, right? For humans who have built their entire lives around the fossil fuel industry, right? The remnants of plant material from millions of years ago, right? Politics, modern day politics, can flip with minor fluctuations in fuel prices or supplies, right? Entire wars can be started based on the competition for these fuel sources. Human history, then, is intimately tied to the historic environments and environmental processes that occurred millions and millions of years ago, right? We must take such a broad time scale into account when we think about the present. A history of fuel and the conflicts related to are also a history of dead plants from an ancient era. Okay, so we're looking at long time. What if we consider something like quick time, as I'm just going to call it here, right? Because if we must consider the implications of sort of the longer terms of history, we must also consider that time might move much faster than humans often understand, right? To many species, the human sense of time is actually glacial, right? It's incredibly slow. Take, for instance, bugs. Let's look at a particular insect, uh, commonly known as the San Jose scale, which is pictured here. It's something I wrote about in my book, so it's sort of front of mind for me. But really, the San Jose scale is not exactly sort of like an overly unique or interesting bug, right? Um, it's not overly unique, and therefore sort of fits into the story of how bugs sort of also move at a different time scale that's different than us. The San Jose scale gets its name because it is a bug that is discovered on plant material that had been imported from Asia into California in the 1870s. At this time period in California, California is starting to grow into a more robust agricultural um, economy. Also, a horticultural industry is starting to develop there as well. And this bug, this San Jose scale, again, because it shows up in San Jose, will quickly have pretty large implications for fruit growers in the area who quickly learn that the insect thrived among the fruit trees in San Jose. The bug would quickly infest large swaths of horticultural landscapes, orchards, and could easily kill an entire crop through quick infestation. Now, this bug had been contained to California for about 20 years, but soon started to move on rail lines, on train cars attached to other plant material. So that by the 1890s, the San Jose scale had appeared in orchards in Missouri and Georgia, New Jersey, New York State. And um, what is different, invasive species had always been around. What was incredibly troubling to onlookers of this spread was the speed at which the San Jose scale could reproduce and spread across an orchard. Because a female scale, once affixed to a tree, can produce several hundred offspring in one birth. Now, given that the scale can bear anywhere from 2 to 6 generations in a year, the possibility of one female scale can produce up to 30 million progeny over the course of a calendar year. Now, this is a disastrous possibility. Again, 30 million progeny in a single calendar year. And if that goes unnoticed, a San Jose scale could easily infest an entire orchard. And this is, I apologize. I mean, I know it's lunchtime, so I apologize if I'm sort of showing people if you want an apple today. This becomes a huge concern for orchardists, farmers, and government agents, because this disastrous insect, as I saw it, right, had the ability to bankrupt hundreds of thousands of fruit growers and potentially destabilize, fruit prices, fruit markets, food supplies as well. So what comes out of this, right? There's debates throughout the 1890s and early 1900s about what to do. What you start to see across state lines is restrictive plant trade laws that will get put into place. Some state governments will have the ability to, if their infestations are identified, state agents can go and burn down entire orchards. Often, what will come out of this is inspections of plant supplies, fruit supplies that are being shipped from plant dealers to any sales made outside of the state. And this little bug essentially causes a national and international panic. Well, over the course of several decades, scientists and horticulturalists will begin to develop pesticides, right, that can kill these and other invasive species. But over time, there's also another problem because insects like the San Jose scale can build up resistance to pesticides and poisons at an incredibly fast rate, right? And this again makes us think about that time scale. Whereas in the human reproduction cycle, right, where humans can also build up resistances to harmful chemicals or viruses, diseases, things like that, right? That um, inheritance of those resistances to toxins and other diseases, right, can take up to it can take multiple generations for that resistance to occur. But again, insects can move much faster. Think of the San Jose scale. All right, anywhere from 2 to 6 generations of bugs can be produced in a single year. That means the speed at which a parent scale passes resistance genes can move exponentially faster. Now, this leads to a whole new issue and essentially makes pesticides outdated within a few years, right? Requiring chemical manufacturers to make stronger, more harmful pesticides to kill what are increasingly becoming super bugs. Um, I also want to know, so this is a big concern in the state of Iowa as well. This is from the proceedings of the Iowa State Horticultural Society that met annually. It was a collection of horticulturalists throughout the state, as well as professors who study things like entomology or horticulture from University of Iowa, but mostly Iowa State as well. This is H.E. Summers, who is the state entomologist based in Ames, Iowa, affiliated with Iowa State University. And if you go through these proceedings, which I'm sure the Historical Society has lots of boxes of or has digitized or something, right? This really, the San Jose scale becomes a major piece of his concern, or at least he's recognizing that growers are very much concerned about this bug that they're hearing about out in California that seems to be spreading everywhere and causing concern. And you can see here throughout the 1890s and really the early 1900s, most of his talks, most of his research is going to be focused on the San Jose scale and what it means for the state of Iowa, right? So it's very much a national history, but it has, as he sees it, very local implications as well, right? It can move quickly. This is a thing of concern, and we should be paying attention to what other states are doing, but also have a plan in place for what Iowa horticulturalists should be doing as well. Environmental history then makes us consider the question of agency. And when I say agency, well, what do I mean, right? It's an action or intervention to produce a particular effect, right? Now, this means in sort of traditional history or sort of non-environmental history, as it had been done, that humans often make choices that bend the shape of history, that bend the course of history. And in the traditional telling of history, we almost exclusively rely on humans to drive the story, to drive history, right? As such, we have a variety of ways of looking at that, right? Cultural history or intellectual history or social history, right? Race and gender history. Right? These things historians are specialized in. They look at all these different ways in which history has changed. People view these things and how those various methodologies shape the course of history and drive history. It's not that environmental history doesn't agree with those, but environmental history also asks this new element, right? What if what drives history, what if causes change is less of human action and human belief, but also non-human agents too, right? What does it mean to make non-human agents as being a relevant and important actor in history? Do animals, do viruses, do diseases have agency to make change, or do they have the power to cause historical shifts? Isn't the story of the San Jose scale a story of one bug shaping human history? Now, the San Jose scale is simply attempting to accomplish what it is always intending to do, which is to multiply, which is to spread, which is to feed, which is to repeat, right? That is the bug's agency or intentionality to produce a particular effect, right? And clearly humans are responding to that bug's actions, right? Summers is making it his primary focus of research, right? States are passing legislation for inspection, for burning, for restricting plants from moving over state lines. That is what I mean when I'm talking about agency and rethinking what agency means if we are to take environmental history seriously. But on the flip side of that, what I don't want us to take away from agency in environmental history is environmental determinism. This is sort of the flip side taken to the nth degree, which is a view that holds sort of environmental features directly determine aspects of human behavior in society, right? Now, historians are very uncomfortable with this. Environmental historians are also very uncomfortable with this, right? This notion that human actions are determined by environmental factors almost implies that there's sort of no real decision-making processes going on, that humans don't have agency as well, right? And I will just say, like, environmental historians do not believe this. Instead, they simply insist that we consider and account for the possibility and reality that non-human agents play a larger role in history than we have often considered, and that we should and would be better served to consider these factors in understanding history, right? We've all sort of lived through the COVID-19 era, right? The virus does what it is intending to do, and humans have the agency and choices to either, wear a mask, not wear a mask, not pass laws, not, or ignore laws. Right? These are the human decisions that are made in the aftermath of environmental contingencies, right? Okay. So this is sort of the groundwork of what I'm working with is sort of what does environmental history mean? What do I'm talking about when I talk about environmental history? And maybe it'll become more apparent as I walk through a few examples of what I'm talking about here. So thinking about long time. Let's talk about glaciers. I always like talking about glaciers. I realize I'm from Michigan originally, and I feel like you can't tell sort of the Michigan story without always starting with a glacier story. And I realize now that I've moved south, I mean, they're really missing out on sort of the glacial history part of it. But it's good to be back in a sort of room of people interested in Iowa history to talk about glaciers again, right? Thinking of this long history, can we tell the story of modern day Iowa, a sort of contemporary Iowa, without going back tens of thousands of years, right? Because the present landscape of Iowa, of the Midwest, reflects millions of years of geological activity, right? The land that is currently called Iowa was the result of millions of years of glacial activity that shaped the landscape. Glaciers had advanced and retreated as global temperatures shifted, which gave the state, sort of the modern day state, its shape. The iconic hills, which had left behind various sediments that would eventually form the basis for vegetation that defines much of modern Iowa. The most notable of the glaciers was part of the most recent advance, which occurred somewhere between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago. This advance dropped off a good deal of till, left behind a good deal of glacial melt, which would create the rivers, the lakes, and shape the hydrology of the modern state as well. And so the knobby moraine ridges and the numerous wetlands are the direct result of stagnant and melting ice sheets. The ecology that would develop from these massive glacial changes also provide us a tool to understand the different groups that would come to inhabit this region, right? And so this map just gives us a sense of the different moraines, the different plains in which glaciers have moved through here. The more recent one is this Des Moines lobe, which is at 12 to 14,000 years, in which the most recent glacier had moved through. But much of this is glaciation periods of this sort of advancing and retreating of glacial periods over uh, um, a longer period of time. So, what is the landscape that comes from this glacial melt, from this changing environment? Well, it looks like this: a tall grass prairie, which will really start to develop in the years after sort of that last retreat of that last glacial period, right? And again, it's very different than sort of the corn and soy that define the modern Iowa landscape. The early tallgrass prairie was a really elaborate and mostly patchwork ecosystem, which is defined by diverse plant and animal life. And I mean patchwork is essentially you would have these large patches of tall grasses, but also interspersed with sort of dense forest as well. This is a modern picture of the Dubuque Arboretum, which is restored prairie, right? So it's not necessarily sort of native tallgrass prairie. It is restored. There's not much tallgrass prairie left to be seen, and we'll talk about that story in a minute here. But this is to give you a sense of what it looks at. But at its peak, I mean, this is a sea of grass, this tall grass prairie, this patchwork ecosystem, that's 167 million acres large, that once stretched from the eastern edge of Illinois, moving west across Iowa, north to southern Minnesota, and also moving through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, even hitting into Texas as well. Now, this part of the earth is poorly drained, meaning that there's a good deal of shallow ponds, there's swamps, there's dense foliage that create incredibly rich ecosystems for a variety of plants and animals. And these grasses are quite large, right? I mean, I think today, if you sort of say the prairie, you sort of think of more of a small grass or small grass, short grass prairie. Further west, sort of the western Dakotas, the western sort of stretch of Nebraska and Kansas and whatnot, sort of knee-high grasses, right? This is a tall grass prairie, which means much of the grasses actually grow to be much taller than the average human, right? And it really is this sort of dense, wet ecosystem that is an attractive landscape for a lot of animals, including, birds, deer, bears, but also bison, right? Which are going to thrive in this tall grass prairie of Iowa for a good deal of time. I think I have a map here. Yes. So you have a map here of where this tall grass prairie would have stretched. Just to give you sort of my local credentials here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm sort of on the eastern. I lived or worked at Eastern Illinois University, sort of on the eastern edge of Illinois there. So again, so we're part of this old history of tallgrass prairie here together. Early indigenous groups, including the Kickapoo, the Shawnee, the Kokia, Meskwaki, Kaskaskia, and Illini, made use of every part of this tall grass prairie. In particular, the bison are of special importance, not only to sort of the sustenance, but also the social, political, and economic lives of several indigenous groups. Right? Groups such as the Illini took tremendous efforts to influence the flow and movement of bison across the tall grass prairie. Now, this often meant planning and controlling burns to promulgate nutrient-rich grasses to attract many of these bison to particular spots. This is also then a space for diplomacy, right? Indigenous groups such as the Illini and Meskwaki often formed alliances working together to hunt bison, which, as you can imagine, is a tremendous feat that does require a great deal of teamwork, communication, and also strenuous labor, right? It takes a lot to hunt bison, but it also takes a great deal of work to clean, to preserve the hunt, etc. And we'll see sort of these large hunting alliances, these large geopolitical alliances that are built around this network around bison. It can also lead to a competition between groups as well, as we'll see here in a minute. But I want to talk about this visualization here for a second because I think the thing about talking about the history of Iowa is, if we're thinking about long time, Iowa's kind of a blip on the map as far as boundaries, political boundaries, and sort of its existence more broadly. There's this great project out of Canada. It's called Native Land CA, which is actually a global effort to map indigenous land claims throughout the globe. But I've zoomed it here in on Iowa. And you can see here, right, a great deal of overlap of different indigenous groups, particularly where, if looking at Eastern Iowa, Western Illinois here, this is sort of the density of that tall grass prairie. That's really where the sort of centerpiece of this geopolitical and social alliances around the bison trade are going to take place, which helps explain sort of the density of those groups in that area as well. Also, its relationship to the Mississippi River should not be understated. Now, this hunt, the centrality of the bison is also going to increase with the arrival of the French. And beginning in the 1680s, French colonial administrators saw this abundant bison population. They saw this tall grass prairie, and they saw it as a prospect for wealth creation. Now, the French did not really commit to settling the region of the tall grass prairie, right? You do have some modest communities that develop in the interior of the continent, mostly along the Mississippi River. It's very different sort of colonization style than you'll see like the English on the East Coast, right? But these are still significant because what essentially gets settled in along these places are trading networks in which the French are going to have a presence in which they are encouraging indigenous groups to go out and hunt, collect as much bison as possible, and essentially create a market for a bison fur trade that will essentially extend as far as sort of if you think about resource extraction and sales, right, from the interior of North America all the way to markets in Europe. And because the process of bison required extensive time and labor, what you'll also start to see starting in the 17th century and into the 18th century is that you'll see even these villages start to pop up throughout the tallgrass prairie that are essentially these small industrial, we might say sort of proto-industrial cities that are really developed around the sole process of collecting of bison furs, of processing bison furs, which also creates a new marketplace for indigenous groups. And that's when you start to see the rise of very large confederations, particularly the Illinois Confederation during the late 17th century, which will include a variety of groups, including the Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Peoria, and many others. And this sets off a wave of competition between indigenous groups in the areas, conflict and warfare as well. This image comes from a Frenchman who is moving through and sort of noticing these large hunting parties. And I think this is sort of really interesting image to think about the amount of coordination and work that goes into hunting bison during this time period. As a result of this new marketplace, as a result of this new trade, you will see bison populations drop precipitously due to these larger economic forces and internal pressures, which will fundamentally shape the ecology of the prairie as bison populations drop. All right, so we're moving forward a little bit. The ecology of the tallgrass prairie, though bison populations are starting to shrink, will really begin to change at the start of the 1800s, after the United States began a process of Western expansion through actions like the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the subsequent removal of indigenous groups through imperial action or settler colonialism, right? Um, and just to give you a sense, right, if we laid out those, what are those key ideas of environmental history, right? We have to understand the ideas as well as the actual physical changes that are going in. And in order to understand the ideas, we don't have to go too far to understand how American diplomats saw expansion, saw the change of the environment and who they thought and what they thought the environment should be used for, right? As Thomas Jefferson, right, in his famous Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1784. And it's quite clear who he believes, right? It's sort of the backbone of the American system, which is the husbandman or the farmer, right? Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, right? I mean, it's sort of right there for you to give you a sense of that, right? And perhaps then it's no surprise that Thomas Jefferson is going to be the individual who really arranges the Louisiana Purchase and makes that happen in 1803. And so this is always meant to be seen as agricultural land, right? A view that's held both by settlers that saw the potential in Western lands as well as the politicians back east who believed agricultural pursuit is the highest calling, right? Ordained by God to be a farmer, right? Jumped ahead a little bit. Sorry. As far as in Iowa goes, right, this begins in earnest in the 1830s after the Blackhawks Purchase in 1832. And really the next wave of settlers that were going to move into, again, this western area, this tall grass prairie, have a different set of values, a different set of visions and priorities. And when they move into this space, the space that is now going to be called Iowa, in the 19th century, they encountered those forests. They encountered those thickets, the marshes, the swamps, the prairies, the tall grasses, right? But there's a problem, right? The environment that they encountered was not the environment that they wanted. And so they went to work, right? They chopped, they drained, they burned, they flattened, they planted, they fertilized, right? They wanted to make a new ecology. Prairie grasses were replaced by grains, by corn, by livestock, and a host of other commodities. Ecologies were changed, biodiversity was affected, and waterways were altered. And you can track this a lot of great publications. I've spent a lot of time personally with the Prairie Farmer. I don't know if we have sort of agricultural historians in here, but the Prairie Farmer is actually an incredible little resource. It's published out of Chicago, but really is sort of the journal that would have been read by most farmers and agriculturalists, horticulturalists for much of the 19th century throughout what is the Midwest, right? And so they would have subscribed to this. It would have come through, and in the pages again. If you're looking for good bedtime reading for a child, this would be great as well. But you can sort of follow and track commodity prices. What new potato is going to be the hot thing on the market, right? Have you heard of this new rutabaga variety? Like it really is sort of a nuts and bolts how to farm, what crops can grow where, uh, um, sort of publication, right? But it is documenting, right? And it's celebrating exactly what we're looking at here, right? How to transform this landscape into something else. I find it sort of ironic that it's called the prairie farmer because, in fact, what the readers of this would have been doing is being sort of a de-prairie farmer. They wanted to get rid of the prairie. They wanted to make something else. And Iowa's population will really start to boom then in the 19th century. All right, in 1840, Iowa had 43,000 settlers. A decade later, nearly 200,000 settlers, and by 1860, over 500,000 people will call Iowa home. Now, the rapid settlement has dramatic changes, mostly transformation of prairie land into farmland, right? And again, these crops that are going to replace that tall grass prairie. Now, this great soil underneath has been thousands and thousands of years of shallow water, dense foliage that's sort of breaking down. This is creating this incredible soil for agricultural pursuits. You've got bison who are sort of doing their thing, dropping their things across the landscape over some millennia as well. Again, I apologize for those who are watching during lunch. But essentially what happens is this is creating the fertilizer for this initial wave of clearing and crop production as well. And today, right, we see the evidence of their success. That is to say, today less than 0.1% of tallgrass prairie remains in Iowa. Um, When I think I lived in Illinois, I think that number was something like 0.04%. I mean, it is incredible how little of this stuff, of this ecology that was so vast, is even left today. All right. And that landscape came to reflect the views, the values, and the priorities of 19th century settlers as well. And what's important is that these settlers, these farmers, always understood that their crops were meant for other mouths right out there. In fact, it's desired for, it's legislated for, and then celebrated. And this becomes obvious when one flips through the annual reports of the State Agricultural Society, an organization that's legislated into existence in 1853 to encourage and track agricultural development in the state. And you can see here J.M. Schaffer, who is the secretary for the Iowa State Agricultural Society, right? As he's measuring and collecting statistics, right? Um, and he's celebrating what he sees to be this transformation of the Iowa landscape. Again, great bedtime reading if you're having a hard time falling asleep. But these are really interesting documents that I'm sure the Historical Society has as well, which really go county by county, year by year, and it's really just a collection of what's growing, how much land's been cleared, how are people getting things to market. It is this incredible insight into environmental change of Iowa during this sort of pivotal century in which the environment is changing so drastically. And Schaffer is quite giddy, right? He's celebrating the weather. He's noting there's no harmful insects, right? He's very much happy with what he sees as the prairie receding and the rows of crops proceeding. And this is a space to revel. I have a map here just to give you a sense of how quickly this process is starting and really taking off in the 19th century here. Corn production, which is still fairly decent in 1859. By 1889, right? I mean, essentially the middle swath of Iowa is the part of this corn belt that's starting to develop as well. Now, the secretary, Schaefer, was also giddy for the development of railroads, which he claimed have been pushed forward with unprecedented vigor, right? And he celebrated the railroad. The railroad meant that Iowan farmers could have a better choice in markets, right? They could easily get their crop on this machine, which would take it to markets where they could sell those crops to eager mouths, right? This would be good. It would speed up economic growth in the region as well, which tells us that Iowan farmers from the very beginning, right, are happily overlooking state boundaries and borders in order to share the results of their environmental transformations with others. What I find interesting personally, as someone who's interested in the question of the Midwest, is the railroad technology and how it shapes a sense of space and place and a sense of cohesion. In Schaefer's 1868 report, he's noticing that this railroad's actually changing the way that Iowans are relating to each other, are relating to their neighbors. He notes that before the war, before the Civil War, right, most of the trade, how it would work is that it would move to the rivers and eventually make its way down the Mississippi River to St. Louis. But the railroads had shifted that, had made it so that St. Louis and Missouri are not necessarily the neighbors or the people that Iowans are thinking about and thinking about markets for. In fact, they're starting to think about Chicago. It's there where railways intersected, where merchants sold these commodities on the brand new Chicago Board of Trade, right? Where raw materials were transformed. It transformed the environment, it transformed space, it transformed time. And this is what I would say, you know, the Iowa story is not all that dissimilar from several of its neighboring states. You know, residents in the Dakotas, in Illinois, in Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Iowa, or no, oh, sorry, in Ohio, are basically experiencing the same thing. Their lives, their environmental changes were connected to each other by Chicago. It's a commercial glue. And this is what I would argue, right, is the material basis for the creation of the Midwest, right? A Gilded Age agricultural economy whose ties were deeply bound by their connection to the metropole in Chicago. And I think I have, yeah, two maps here. You can see how quickly this railroad network is starting to expand in by 1860, they're still calling the West, right? But it won't be until the turn of the 20th century that you're going to start to hear it, or even the notion of the Midwest, right, doesn't come about until the early 20th century, late 19th century. But within 30 years, you see a drastic increase in railroad construction. And again, for Iowa farmers, a lot of that is being directed straight at Chicago. So we see here over the course of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 up until 1890, this record of what this map is depicting, tremendous change demographically, economically, infrastructurally, but as we're interested in here, sort of environmentally. Okay, I'm going to jump us again ahead to another story. I think I've got a little bit more time, so I'm going to talk about this. We're going to move all the way up to the 1970s, and that is the farm crisis. Now, I know many of you probably were on the presentation last with Dr. Corey Holla, who I think probably talked a little bit about the farm crisis. He's much more equipped to talk about this than me. So I encourage you to go back and watch that recording, which was really great. And he's also just fun to listen to talk, right? But I also want to talk about the farm crisis because it is a significant political moment, which is what someone like Dr. Holla is interested in. But I think it's an interesting way to think about the environment, right? And so some of the basis that will lead or the help to explain this crisis in the 1970s that really goes through the 1980s into the early 90s. You have these new technologies that are being introduced into agriculture. They're you know marketed as being sort of this more efficient way to grow. Ag policy starting to change in the 1960s as well, which is encouraging or in many cases sort of forcing farmers to plant as much as possible. The goal is to get big or you got to get out, right? So you are investing in new technologies, machinery that is going to increase production on those farms as well, which means farmers are taking out a lot of loans in the 1960s and 1970s to buy this equipment, right? Well, the 1970s economy, the stagflation economy, which is a stagnant growth, while also you have inflation, is starting to put some pressure on farmers. This is really going to take off in the late 1970s when you see interest rates drastically increase, which makes it very, very difficult for farmers to start to begin to pay back these loans. And they're going to start to feel this pinch, right? You're also seeing trade deficit, not trade deficits, reduction in trade, particularly after the USSR invades Afghanistan and Jimmy Carter stops shipments of grains to the USSR, which also hits prices. So you have a variety of methods that are leaving or sort of leading to this farm crisis during this time period. And as loans become difficult to repay, you're starting to see farmers go bankrupt, right? And again, this is for many people, this is sort of a common story in Iowa. This is beautifully laid out in, Pamela Riney Kerberg's book, When a Dream Dies. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. But essentially, what does this mean for the environment? What does this mean on the ground, right? That the number of farms, right, the actual farms ownership will fall dramatically from 126,000 farms about in 1978 to about 96,000 farms in 1992. Now, that's a decline of nearly a quarter of farm ownership. Now, what I mean is that the ownership of these farms decreases, but farmland does not necessarily disappear. That land is often bought up and it's absorbed so that other farms are starting to get bigger. Small farms were starting to be a thing of the past. Big farms, whose structure increasingly starts to look a little more like corporations, become the norm. And when the collapse of the family farm in Iowa, you start to see a larger agricultural economy transform from small scale producers to large corporations. And agribusiness becomes this new buzzword, becomes the new mode of production. Right? You start to see the rise of monocrop plantings, less diversification, right? Agribusiness and corporate consolidation helps to explain a shift in environmental use in Iowa, but also helps to explain the rise of CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. Now, these operations are exactly what they sound like. These are acres of fields, of barns, feeding sheds where dense populations of livestock are housed, fed, and fattened before making their way to the slaughterhouse and ultimately your dinner table. I'm going to skip lunch entirely in case you are all enjoying that right now because I'm going to ruin it for you real quickly. This is big business in Iowa, CAFOs, right? In fact, by 2006, there were more than 3,800 CAFOs scattered across the state. The concentrations of these operations has very real biological and environmental implications, right? The animals in those CAFOs do what all animals do. They poop, right? Their refuse collects, it seeps, it drains, and flows to nearby waterways. And there's lots of it, right? Seriously, the Iowa's rivers and watersheds are filled with this stuff. Refuse from pigs, chickens, cattle, and turkeys all flow through the Des Moines, Iowa, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, among others. And according to Iowa researcher Christopher Jones, the output from these animals, combined with human waste, resembles patterns that one might expect from a population of roughly 168 million people. But, that's not the 3.2 million that currently call Iowa home. And in the process, those streams, those creeks and rivers see a significant rise in nitrate. Now, nitrate in high levels is not good for human health or ecological diversity. It reduces oxygen levels in water, which essentially chokes out various species through hypoxia, which again is just sort of the reduction of oxygen, which is essentially creating ecological dead zones. Some attempts have been made to remedy this situation and remove nitrate from waterways because traditional drinking water facilities are simply not handled or cannot handle or they're not equipped to deal with this nitrate, these high nitrate levels. But for the most part, animal feces and nitrate from them flow through Iowa. But this Iowa story is not simply an Iowa story. And here, this is another screenshot from an interactive map where you can see this sort of time scale of where these CAFOs are located. If you click, or if you follow that link, starts with the 1990s moving forward, but you can see sort of a quick uptick in where these CAFOs are located in Iowa. The Iowa story has implications elsewhere. After all, what happens at one Iowa CAFO has an impact elsewhere. This fact is abundantly clear to fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico who are forced to respond to the nitrate-laden water that collects and flows down the Mississippi. And over the past several decades, animal waste from CAFOs in Iowa and throughout the Mississippi watershed have created essentially a dead zone off the coast of Texas and Louisiana, a swath of water with oxygen levels so low most fish can't survive. Shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico don't know what a CAFO is, but they certainly feel it, right? And what this tells us is that Iowa's environmental history is not Iowa's alone. And we should, think about that as we consider sort of the geographic spread or sort of the implications of environmental history as well. So maybe we should end with some concluding thoughts here based on our very brief and expansive environmental history that I've presented here. Now consider who or what has the agency in that CAFO story. Iowa capitalists, right, established the CAFOs and thus created the conditions for fecal effluence. They are the real actors, to be sure. But what about the larger economic forces, right? Capitalists seeking profits, consumers seeking meat, laborers working in the CAFO, or political decisions that encourage and or sustain the CAFO in the first place? Or is it the defecating livestock whose actions shaped ecological realities and human actions, such as building treatment facilities? Then again, livestock are not consciously dictating the chemical makeup of their own waste. Perhaps nitrate is the real agent of change here. And there's a case to be made for each of these, or all of them, right? And that's the dilemma of environmental history for environmental history, right? It is a field that requires an investigation of the complex biological, cultural, ecological, economic, political, and social entanglements of the past. And so taking environmental history seriously means that scholars must consider the political boundaries, that political boundaries are not necessarily the most helpful framework for thinking about the past or the present. It requires new ways to imagine local and state histories. And it also reminds us that the Iowa we know today was the result of historical processes and change, and that the Iowa of tomorrow will look very different yet. But by paying attention to the environment, we can understand historical actors as well as their motivations as they attempted to remake the Earth according to their vision. Thank you so much. And that is the end, and I'm happy to sort of open it up to questions for those who have it.
Thank you, Dr. Bird. We have time to answer some questions. As a reminder, if you do have a question, drop that into the Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom page. And please note, we may not have time to get to all of your questions, but in the next 5 or 6 minutes, we'll get to as many as we can. And I'll just tell you, Dr. Bird, as a geographer by trade, I am excited to hear about environmental history. So I'm curious, what got you interested in environmental history in the first place?
Such a good I mean, I feel like I should have that answer ready to go all the time. I don't know, I took a class as an undergrad. It was like a survey class. Um, I think it was a book, oh yeah, Bill Cronin's Changes in the Land, and he spends time just talking about um, clearing of forests and how that changes the temperature in sort of forest cover, just sort of locally, right? And how that can dry out soil or change the way that animals move through places, thus changing hunting patterns, right? And sort of this simple awareness and paying attention to the environment is a really interesting way for me to understand how humans think and operate, right? The environment is in many ways an influence on the human, but also in many ways a mirror of human concerns and values. So for me, it's just sort of an interesting way to think of the past.
Absolutely. We've got our first question rolling in here through the chat.
Great.
Were there marketing efforts in the early 1870s to draw immigrants to Iowa to farm?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? And many of those advertisements are actually put out by those railroad companies who are encouraging settlement in the West. I mean, a lot of those are what's interesting if you go into the archives, and I'm sure the State Historical Society has these as well, but a lot of the times, immigrant groups from Europe are also being sold the promise of settling in these places, and you'll see like a lot of like the Burlington and Iowa Railroad Company is translating its advertisements, shipping them over the Atlantic, and sort of promising, like, you can get great soil, you can get a great piece of land in the American West, Iowa, and everything will grow here, right? It's all sunny and there's no issues at all. Very optimistic and exactly the sort of the marketing appeal you would get from a company that is very invested in getting people to buy as much land as possible. Yeah. So the answer is yes.
A question about your CAFO map. I don't know if you want to go back to it.
Sure.
But what they're curious, what was the difference between the red and the green dots on that
Yeah,
CAFO map?
yeah, hold on, let me get that back. I mean, I might be able to pull it up, but essentially the colors of the dots are the years it's associated with. So I think the way that they have the map, and again, I think, can you see the link at the top there? If
Yeah, we can see that.
okay. So the environmental working group, if you type in environmental working group CAFO map, like it'll be the first thing that pops up on Google. Right. And so I think yellow is I want to say the 90s or the 2000s. Anyway, it's sort of each dot, the color represents the decade in which the CAFO was established. So you can track by decade sort of the spread of these things, of these little sites across Iowa, or essentially since the 1990s.
I appreciate the attention to detail in the maps. And what I think is always interesting, crossing over history and geography, is looking at something across time versus
Mhm.
looking across space. And then I appreciate that you've put those two together. I'm curious how you see that interplay between time and space in the way that we define the heartland or the Midwest, defining it as a region. To what extent do you think environment plays a big role in that versus culture or cultural landscape?
As an environmental story, I mean, this is to me, regional history and regional studies are fascinating because I think you're right. I think it's very much geographers are very interested in this question of regionality and what defines it. For me, there is such thing as a cultural geography, but I'm still sort of the environmental historian in me, the materialist in me tells me that there has to be those cultural connections, those those ideas and those beliefs have to be born from the ways in which sort of materially, that is to say, economically and thus environmentally, people are connected, right? So when I talk about sort of the growth of Chicago and the Chicago Board of Trade, that really is a significant moment for growers nationwide, but particularly in the Midwest. And I'm always a little cautious of talking about the Midwest before really the 1890s, because the term the Midwest isn't being used at all really before the 1890s, because it hasn't been sort of culturally invented yet, right? It comes about from those connections because of those economic relations. What I would say is it's not inherent that someone in Minnesota has an inherent connection to someone in Iowa that makes them see each other and say, oh, clearly we're both Midwesterners, right? That connection has to come from some sort of shared economic and or sort of environmental connection, in which sort of then there's some cultural backfill that gets put in there to sort of help solidify that. And what I mean also, and I know this is sort of a rambly question here, but you've got me wind up on regionalism. Is that the Midwest, even of 1900, is not the Midwest today. Sure, it might look that way with the states stay the same age, but if we also have to constantly historicize what we mean when we talk about the Midwest, and if the Midwest was once agricultural production by a wide range of farmers connected together because of their shared connection to the Chicago Board of Trade, well, there's a lot less farmers today, right? So it can't be that anymore. So when we say Midwest in the year 2025, what are we talking about? What are the connective tissues that are gluing this thing together? Or perhaps they don't exist in the same way. And that's also a possibility as well.
We'll have to
Oh,
leave our debate of who is in the Midwest for another webinar, and is
yeah,
and
there's a
why
whole other thing.
Michigan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, one last question for you. Could you put in a bit of a plug for your book, The Roots of Flower City, where we can go to find it, and what we might find when we grab it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Roots of Flower City was recently published in October, Cornell University Press. You can go straight to the Cornell University Press um, website and you'll find it there. Or you can go to my personal website and there's a link for it there at just camdenburd.com. It's pretty complicated. But it is very much sort of in line with this talk. When I was interested, I did my PhD in Rochester, and Rochester is an post-industrial city. Right, probably more famously known for its history related to Kodak. I was shocked as you go through the city, it's always described as Flower City. And I was like, why is it called Flower City? It's, if you go to certain sort of post-industrial parts of the city, it's not particularly beautiful. I mean, I have a fondness for the sort of Rust Belty aesthetic, but I wouldn't sort of say it in the classical sense. But I was sort of interested in historicizing that. And I really settled on a group of agriculturalists, horticulturalists, who are plant dealers. And Rochester in the middle of the 19th century really is the epicenter of the horticultural plant trade, which has not really been historicized at all. And what I realized in doing that history was from this little city, this little horticultural trade in which there are hundreds of nurseries and nurserymen um, selling plants, moving plants, right? That they are from this small city transforming much of the American West, including places like Iowa. So there's definitely some Iowa history in that book as well. But if you're interested in sort of 19th century American history, environmental history, it's definitely a book that you should get interested in. And I'm sure I won't get any royalties, so that is not necessarily even a plug for the sale right there.
Perfect. All right. So with that, we'll rush to the bookshelves. And we're going to bring this webinar to a close. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Dr. Camden Burd. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on February 13th. The topic will be a feature on our National History Day in Iowa program. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.